Hey, this is G. Bruxack from Outlier Automation. I'm here at Realize Live. I'm here with Francis from Siemens, and we're talking about a little bit with digital transformation, cloud, and how customers can actually get to digital transformation, however they define that.
I'm Francis Vatakancherry. I'm part of the Siemens organization focused on initiatives around what we call as a smart connected factory, representing the cloud solutions and how we actually bring outcomes for the shop floor, bringing in from an OT/IT integration all the way to applications which can be leveraged by shop floor to derive value.
So if you have a customer that has a bunch of factories that are old and they haven't started from anywhere, how are you working with customers and what type of recommendations are you typically helping them through?
The reality today with manufacturing operations and with factories is you're typically on an automation landscape, which has more than likely been out there for decades. It could be ranging from something which has been out there for the last few decades to something which is more greenfield. We recognize that it's important to meet the customer, meet every plant where they are. We want to make sure that the technology that we bring in is agnostic to the automation that you represent today in your plant, and have the ability to address your needs in terms of being able to bring about that OT/IT integration and be able to scale that and drive some outcomes for it. So from a Siemens perspective, the technology we bring in is very open, scalable, and can address a very broad set of brownfield challenges, as we have done successfully with many customers.
Where's the first place that you start if a customer recognizes that they need to use more technology in their business operations, etc.? Where do you start? Like, what's the first question that you ask?
One of the questions which we ask customers is, where do you see a pain, or what is the pain that you experience today? It's very important to recognize that you start the journey on something which has the ability to provide you with value quickly, and equally important is that the value you generate, you want to make sure that it can scale. Because many a time, these initiatives, when it comes to driving digital transformation, very quickly become what I would call technology feasibility exercises, trying to beat the OT integration and others. You lose the bigger plot here, which is deriving value for the organization. So it's very important to start with that pain point and the value and use that as the core around which you build different use cases. It could be more than one use case, and we strongly recommend customers approach it with a portfolio mindset, which is, if I can address for this pain point or a set of adjacent pain points, these 2 or 3 or 4 use cases, that lends itself the ability for you to find the right starting point. And then you look at your ecosystem to find out how best does that ecosystem on the OT side, as well as some of the technology dependencies you have, how do you actually tackle that? It always has to start with a very strong and objective problem statement, which you have a very high level of conviction that is going to derive value.
And who are the people, or what is the process involved in actually determining that value? Do you see that it's best at the executive level and down, or who is involved in the customer level to determine that?
Typically, we approach it from 2 levels. One level is more around, I would call it, understanding it in the context of a plant as to what is it that they are focusing on, what are the core initiatives that the plant is driving towards its own P&L. But we recognize that this journey doesn't necessarily happen completely independently at a plant level. It is something tied to a corporate level initiative too. So when we bring about digital transformation, we leverage some of our core tenets like digital threads, which actually help the customer walk the journey that they are likely to derive these benefits with, and use that as the framework for you to understand where you can actually make a start. So it's very important to understand the big picture of where you are taking this one small step in the journey, and then be able to drive that into something which is more broader. And taking a digital thread-based approach from our perspective really helps a customer understand why they take a step and in which direction it goes and how it all fits into a platform-based approach and also a portfolio-based strategy tackling use cases.
So if someone's not familiar with it, though, what is a digital thread and how do you define that?
A digital thread, the simplest way to represent it is when you want to go from point A to B. When we talk about digital transformation, it's an aspiration to get to, in a plant context, what I call zero unplanned downtime, zero scrap, or getting control over quality and going lean. In a transformation journey, you do have a destination that you work towards. The digital thread walks you through the steps that actually takes you to that end destination, and it brings along with it the different artifacts that could be ranging from the digital twin that we represent for the different elements of your scope, and making sure that you are able to build the level of detail to actually take you all the way to the finish line. So it is more of helping you with the journey so that every step you make, you know what direction and what trajectory you're taking that gets you to the North Star as
And
far as
actually what
manufacturing
happened, right?
excellence.
Once your model of what happened or what you want to do and what actually happened, and then
Exactly.
be able to iterate and improve, right?
Right. I think it's important to understand the trajectory you're going and how well it is aligned with your manufacturing excellence goals. Doing sometimes in isolation and problem solving not only takes you off that trajectory, but I think the more harmful byproduct is you very quickly start ending up building silos within your own manufacturing operations. And then it becomes a bigger challenge to bring all these different elements of data and start making more insightful decisions, because it very quickly turns out to be much more complex IT OT endeavor than it needs to be. So some element of putting it in context of a big picture, leveraging digital threads, makes it a very calibrated approach based on what's your appetite for cost, what's your appetite for time, what's your appetite for resources, and most importantly, what's your appetite for change.
Once an organization decides what those value or use cases are, whether it be throughput, quality, etc.,
Right.
what's the next step? Like, how do they choose what to actually do and put something in action?
So I think once they identify a problem statement, put it in the context of a digital thread, where we get into looking at what exactly is going to enable them to be able to address this particular use case. And of course, it all starts with data, because the data becomes the key driver that helps you make that use case a reality, or the outcome a reality. Now, having the data identified is one aspect to it, but I think getting the data and bringing the context of the data is where I think mostly customers get challenged, partly because of the brownfield nature of the ecosystem. But I think it's also about having the ability to transform raw data into what I would call contextual data, because a data point or a data element is only insightful if I have a context to it. So if there is a condition of a machine, I need to know at what state of time and function did the condition deteriorate, without which it doesn't make much sense for a factory to derive much value. Getting the data from its source to a contextual level, which is being able to relate the data from a machine to a process to the product context there, like what product is being manufactured in which batch, things like that. It's important to have that context, because once you have that, then when you're problem solving, you are able to tackle different aspects of how it's impacting your productivity at the shop floor. And I think it's important to have a mechanism to bring all the data together contextually. And now, very quickly, all this data can be transformed into what I would call, industry KPI-based applications, which can do that transformation from raw data to a KPI. And I think that's what customers are really looking for, a shortest path or an easiest path to that.
What do typically customers get stuck on? In that, like, you have that vision. I love that vision of the context, right?
Right.
But like, what holds them up, and where do they get stuck?
I think one of the biggest challenges customers have is, in some instances, they're not aware of the scope of data that is required to address a particular need. That's an education. But I think the hardest technical challenge they deal with is ability to bring that data that they have identified, understanding whether that data resides in a controller. Can it be made available to a PLC in terms of tags? Do I have the ability to bring the machine state or the machine parameter information in context with the process it's running and the part that's running on the line? This data typically happens to reside in multiple places. So having a platform where you can bring this data through various means, because you cannot pipe all the data through one channel. So the whole brownfield connectivity challenge is about bringing this data into one common framework, which you can now use to feed your application. So the biggest stumbling block for customers is they more than likely have this data, at least partially, if not in its 100%, sitting in pockets of a manufacturing shop floor. Could be some are sitting at a SCADA level, some are sitting at a database, some are still sitting at a PLC, which has not even been tagged.
Or a piece of
Or on a
paper.
piece of paper. So how do I bring all this data together? And I don't want to oversimplify this challenge, but the fact that we have means to actually get to the data and bring it all contextually with an application, I think that's a huge step in terms of making this particular outcome they are desiring a reality. And we believe we have a huge role to play as Siemens, given the domain expertise we bring from the automation, the IT expertise we bring with our software portfolio, and also understanding that what OT-IT integration means, given our manufacturing pedigree. So we certainly would like to leverage those learnings and the technology, couple that with execution experience, and help with that biggest challenge, because once we have it, now you are getting into the world of what I would like to always use as the Netflix or the Amazon Primes, which is you turn it on and you start realizing the value.
Right.
And today that is real. It's no longer something which is futuristic. Customers are doing it, like what we have as an example where we connected more than 70 plants in less than 6 to 7 months. Unheard of, not possible, in the past. But when you bring in cloud, when you bring in software as a service, exactly what Netflix and Amazon Prime is, we are bringing that into the automation world. And that is real today. And we have customers who are leveraging it today.
That's great. Yeah. I think even getting the building blocks in place, right? Like
Yeah.
if you have to have the connectivity of the machines, you might have machines that are custom made, right? You don't even know what data's in there, right? And
Correct.
like working through those things and being committed to understanding it and like get that value right away is so important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the learning curve here is more about, I would say, calibrating your aspirations. And I always like to say it's a crawl, walk, run. And aspirationally, you might want to tackle a use case which is fairly sophisticated or complex. But I would always say look at problems where, or pain points where I think the scope of value you realize out of solving that problem might not be huge. But if you can take that value and multiply it across the asset or the landscape of your plant, or scale it in terms of use cases, that's going to be the key, because you almost want an ROI to feed the next use case rather than look for something which has got a significant amount of investment. It's not just about money. I think for shop floor, it is equally or probably more harder to find time to dedicate for these kind of outcomes. So you want to tackle something which is quick to realize value and something which can scale, because the amount of trust and momentum it builds into a digital transformation is significant. And I would say it's grossly underestimated in terms of what it can do. So you always want to tackle it, take it small, but make sure that the context does not get lost. And that's where the digital thread really helps in putting it in context of where you want to go and how that actually helps you with the journey.
We've been talking a lot about like value and kind of like non-concrete terms, I would say, right? Like you kind of have to understand business and it's not specific to a business.
Right.
What would you say is a good starting point to drive this value, right? Like it's always going to be specific to a manufacturer, but like what is a more universal way that someone might be able to derive value and get this momentum?
I've been working with the customer in the trenches for a good part of my 25 plus years with Siemens. I call it, being part of the action and not so much being part of the vision. So I can talk with some conviction the fact that there is a strong connect I can establish. I'd like to use a customer example to actually make this point. In this particular case, the initiative around digital transformation took shape out of an initiative which was tied to sustainability. Now, at the face of it, it might come across as something disconnected from shop floor operations and how you're actually driving manufacturing operational efficiency metrics. The connect here was the fact that the scope of this customer's need was tied around decarbonization as an organizational level. And as you know, if you're familiar with sustainability, we talk about scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. And scope 1 emissions, in a simple way to look at it, is what are you directly responsible for in terms of creating, greenhouse gases, and how you can actually limit it. Now, this is a big thing for a lot of companies, because it's not only a plant level conversation of saving energy or reducing the carbon footprint for the plant, but I think it's a conversation that's at a boardroom level too, because it becomes a critical component of your ESG metrics. It's the environmental, social governance metrics that are tracked, and your valuation of the company as well as your access to capital market and funds are actually a direct correlation of how you fare on ESG metrics. So companies are today certainly focused in that domain. And in this particular example, the customer decided to take that as a vehicle to bring about that digital transformation. And the long and the short story version of the story is, aspirationally, they wanted to try and connect a large set of plants, over 70 of them globally, And they were able to accomplish this OT-IT integration in a very, very short time, in less than 6 to 7 months. Now, how does this connect to the scope of operational use cases I was talking about? There is a strong correlation between energy and energy data when we start taking it into the levels of how is energy being consumed by a section of the plant, by a line, by a cell, or by a specific machine. Because then we are talking about how it is impacting the condition of the machine, because it is a function of how energy is being consumed. So customers realize that if I put this plumbing in place of having this OT-IT integration, now I have the ability to not only realize energy savings, reduce my carbon footprint, and meet the customer defined corporate sustainability KPIs, and have plant saving, energy savings, because energy costs are spiraling. So shaving off 3%, 5% has a significant impact on your P&L. If you're able to leverage that same ecosystem that you have built to address other shop floor outcomes which are in the operational realm, like overall equipment effectiveness, not knowing what it is, but how you impact it, condition health monitoring of your assets, being able to predict the behavior or the condition of your assets, which can give you absolute control over what every plant aspires, a zero unplanned downtime. Now, these are all industry standard KPI driven outcomes, which applies to every plant. But the beauty is what became a vehicle to actually enable all that happen to be coming through an energy transparency or an energy baseline initiative.
Gotcha.
So that's a great opportunity area for customers to look at, because you are now addressing multiple outcomes and the ROI is rapid, and you have the ability to scale, as I shared with the example, because
Right.
the challenges are minimal.
Right. So you're basically saying that in order to get the energy data, you still need that IT connectivity to the machines to actually put sensors there or whatever onto the machine. And it could be done in parallel.
Correct.
And then once you get that, then you can start to gather more data that you might not have had before.
Right. And you start at a plant level. So going back to meeting the customer where you are. So we are primarily talking about collecting data from at a plant where the utilities coming into the plant, they typically are metered, whether they're analog meters, digital meters, or smart meters. Just being able to collect that data, you are going to use the same infrastructure from an automation standpoint, where you have the OT network where these devices sit. You have the data that are collected directly from PLCs or from the meters using Modbus GCP backnets protocols, which are standard out there. And that same out infrastructure, including the gateway that connects to your SaaS or the cloud, is going to be the one that you'll be using connecting to a machine PLC or a sensor too. So you have basically addressed a challenge which was an obstacle for you to address your operational use case by tackling something which was much more foundational, much easier to accomplish, and starts deriving value very quickly.
And I would imagine that it feels a lot less risky too, because
Absolutely.
you aren't actually modifying the machines that are in your production. You're monitoring it outside of that, but you're getting that value that is driving your business and making more money.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the big things where customers want to meet them where they are, which means I do not want to make changes to my OT network or my OT landscape. I need to start deriving value, and I would like to now plow back in that value that I realize into addressing a broader set of outcomes. And if there is a change in the OT landscape that can enable it and justify that business case, by all means. But what you do not want to do, or there's a lot of hesitation, is I want to realize the value and then make an investment versus having to make a whole bunch of investment and hope that the value is derived. Like the simple analogy I use is you sign into a Netflix subscription and you watch the movie right away. You don't want to be signing in and then having to wait for 6 months and not even be sure whether I can watch a movie. So that's the kind of change of approach here, where you're talking about delivering value at the point at which where they are, and then scaling it by tackling something more, I would call it sophisticated in terms of the technical use case, but also tying it to something which is of higher value. So you don't have to chase the higher value problem up front. It could be something small that you tackle, like what our MD uses. It's very important to tackle technology with purpose. And the speed of adoption of the technology will always be a function of relevancy. So the adoption will be at the speed of relevancy, as he says, which is so true, because sometimes you have to solve that small problem. Make sure you use the relevant piece of technology and make sure that is relevant to you because you're getting some immediate value.
As an engineer, I feel like I always want to like use some cool technology, but it's like, why are we doing this, right? You
Correct.
have to always like bring it back to that use case.
And I have to fall on the sword, as we say, myself, saying that being a Siemens and coming in with a wealth of technology that we carry in our portfolio, it's very compelling for us to hold back, not speak about those things. But sometimes we just have to discipline ourselves to listen to the customer and understand that 5% of that portfolio, the technology that bring, is solving 95% of what they are wanting to do today. And we get caught up with the 5%, which is aspirational. So sometimes we have to focus on our 5% and focus on their 95% and make sure that we align on those and make it real for the customer. And I think that's the start of a digital transformation journey.
Awesome. Well, I love that vision. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thanks, G. And it's always a pleasure to learn from people like you who are in the, on the ground, feeling the heartbeat of what the challenges are. More than happy to share whatever we learned from people like you and our customers.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a good day.